Hello and welcome back to Nutrition Coaching and Life. My name is Lisa. I'm the head coach and owner of Nutrition Coaching and Life. On Wednesdays, I love to jump on here to talk about some of the most recent research as it pertains to exercise science and nutrition, because we love to help people lose fat, gain muscle, recomp their bodies, and so it is important to us to keep up to date with the latest research, with the latest science. And today's topic is once again near and dear to my heart because I have been on a glute gaining journey for quite some time now, and this paper is titled Examination of the Gluteal Muscle Activity Associated with Dynamic Hip Abduction and Hip External Rotation Exercise, a systematic review by Macadam et al. From 2015, with someone that I follow or have been following for a while. Brett Contreras is a contributing author here. And yeah, I'm excited to dive into it. I hope you too look forward to learning more about how we can optimize our glute growth through optimizing the activity in specific muscles and also selecting the right exercises. So let's dive right into it. But of course, if you enjoy this, do me a favor, subscribe, hit the notifications bell, check out some of our other content like our podcast, like our Instagram, where we try to share some valuable information as well, or hit us up on LinkedIn, wherever you like. I would love to connect with you. In any case, let's get started. So today's paper, as I was said, was titled Examination of the Gluteal Muscle Activity Associated with Dynamic Hip Abduction and Hip External Rotation Exercise, a Systematic Review. So before you think, oh, okay, this is just going to be another thing about squats and hip thrusts and so on, no, because it is about hip abduction. So clearly this is not a hip thrust or anything like that in there. I'm going to touch on that point in a little bit, but the paper itself does not go into those specific exercises. So the objectives of this systematic review was to quantify the electromyographic EMG activity of exercises that utilize the gluteus maximus, so Gmax, we're going to refer to it from here on, and the gluteus medius, so Gmed, we're going to refer to it, during hip abduction and hip external rotation. The study sought to establish which exercises best target these muscles and the extent of their activation. You might be wondering why not the glute minimus or gluteus minimus, and that is because of its anatomical position. So it's kind of like tucked in there below the glute medius and so on, and so you can't really assess it via the EMG. The methods that these researchers used was a systematic search across multiple databases, including PubMed, Sport Discuss, Web of Science, and so on. Sorry, I just should continue with my slideshow here. And they used relevant phrases connecting gluteal activity and EMG. A total of 575 articles were reviewed, but in the end, ultimately 23 studies met the criteria for analysis. Overall, there were a total of 467 subjects, 194 male, 197 female, and 76 had the sex not provided. So while the total number of exercises was 52. Therefore, I won't be listing all of them. And at first, I thought, okay, I'm going to go over all of them. But of course, we're going to highlight the most important ones. Again, here, sorry for the methods. I'm a little behind on the slideshow. Okay, now the most important takeaways, of course. The highest Gmax activation was observed during lateral step up, so lateral sideways step up, crossover step up, which is essentially also a form of a lateral step up, but instead of starting with the leg that's closest to the box, the bench or whatever, you would start with the inside leg and literally cross over to get onto the box. And then the third one is the rotational single leg squat. I have to be completely honest, I had never seen this exercise until I looked at this paper and looked up what the exercise was. So essentially it's like a floating squat or a Bulgarian split squat, but you then rotate the torso. Let's just say you hold a med ball in your hand while you're doing your Bulgarian split squat. You're squatting down, you're dropping the med ball to the side on which your it doesn't actually matter to which side you're dropping, but you're dropping to the side, and then as you're standing up, you're actually rotating your torso and stretching up your torso as well. This rotation, this trunk rotation, activates the glute max even further, according to this. And then the fourth one, oh no, sorry. So those were the top three, with activation levels ranging from 79% to 113% on the MVIC. Give me 1 second because I noted down what that meant, the MVIC. Well, I will let you know anyway. This is the way that the activation is measured. I have it further down. I promise. Should have known that. But yeah, then let's go into the highest glute medius activation, and that is found during a side bridge with hip abduction. So often we see that, and you kind of like the star thingy where you have one leg on the ground, and need to work on my camera angle skills. You have one leg on the ground and the other one sort of up, so kind of like a star. Then you have the standing hip abduction with elastic resistance at the ankle. And the reason it's saying with the elastic resistance is because they didn't actually assess any cable movements here. Or side-lying hip abduction, so sort of like clamshells. And here the activation levels ranged from 81% to 103% on the MVIC. Again, I will let you know what that is later on. And as I said, glute minimus activation was not assessed in all of this. I won't provide all the exercises that were assessed. I will provide the link in the show notes for what paper that is, so you can look them up, all 51 if you want, 52. But yeah, so standing position exercises were generally lateral step-ups, crossover step-ups, rotational single leg squat, standing hip abduction with elastic resistance, standing wall push exercises, lateral lunges, standing hip joint strengthening exercises. So the ones that, of course, have not been mentioned earlier were the ones with lower or less activation on the EMG. And the side lying position exercises were side lying hip abductions, side bridge with hip abduction, lying leg raises, clamshell exercises, seated position exercises, seated hip abduction machine, which I'm surprised that didn't show the highest activation. And then various seated variations were used but only had a limited representation in the study. So maybe one or two will have assessed them out of the 52. Once again, the reason why it doesn't say squats or hip thrusts or whatever we often think of first when we talk about glute building exercises is because this is specific to hip abduction or hip external rotation exercises. So what I was curious, what exercises showed the least activation out of all of them, and that was the monster walk exercise. They tested for 3 variations, very, very small glute max activation of 4 to 6%, and even for the glute medius activation, 12 to 18. So certainly not one of the best exercises for activation. Even the clamshells didn't have a ton of activation. 4 variations at least. They exhibited some of the lowest levels of activation for the glute med. Yes, it was mentioned that for the glute max, I believe it was somewhat helpful exercise. No, sorry, the other way around, glute med. But yeah, in any case, side-lying hip abduction exercises were also not that helpful for the glute maximum. Clams and side-lying hip abductions were mostly helpful for the glute medius. I do want to talk about the regular squats and leg press and hack squats and pendulum squats and deadlifts and RDLs and hip thrusts, all the good ones that we usually think of when we want to get the most bang for our buck for glute building exercises. I do believe, though, that if someone is having severe deficiencies in either one, the glute med or the glute max, targeting or using some of these exercises to activate before the good compounds, that could be a really good idea. So for example, let's just say doing some lateral step-ups or crossover step-ups in order to activate your glute max before you're actually doing your squats, or doing some side lying, some side bridges with hip abductions, like the star thing that I talked about, to activate your glute medius. That actually one of my glute medius on the right side in particular used to be a muscle very, very, I guess, inactive due to an injury and a sciatic nerve tweak that I had on that side for a while, and so I have been building it up and over the last 2 years, and I can proudly say that I now know how to activate it, and I now know it now has balanced out. But in any case, let's talk about those ones. So while the specific research document here, so this paper does not provide information on squats, leg press, deadlifts, and hip thrust exercises, we can infer their relevance based on established EMG findings in similar studies. For example, on the hip thrust, the glute max activation, often rated among the highest for glute activation, with reports showing activation levels frequently exceeding 90% of the MVIC. So yes, MVIC, and with glute medius activation also beneficial, but tends to focus more on glute max overall. So that was for the hip thrust. Then the deadlift, another popular exercise which is often linked to glute growth, also has, when it comes to the glute max activation, this exercise generally demonstrates high activation of the glute max, particularly during the upward lifting phase. So that would be the concentric phase. And for the glute medius activation, moderate activation, it helps in stabilizing the pelvis throughout the lift. Then moving on to the squat. For glute max activation, a solid compound movement that activates glute max well, often showing 60 to 80% MVIC depending on squat depth and technique. For the glute medius activation, good activation levels can activate more effectively with variations like single leg squats, as in also step ups and so on, or wide stance squats actually. As for the leg press, glute medius activation, moderate to high EMG activity can be observed typically around 50 to 70 MVIC. Glute medius activation, this exercise does not emphasize glute medius as strongly as others. Activation levels may be on the lower end compared to the above exercises. So yes, I hope you find this helpful. To sum up, here's a quick ranking based on typical EMG activation levels. Hip thrust, high glute max activation. Deadlift, high glute max activation. Moderate glute medius activation. Squat, good glute max activation, good glute medius activation. Leg press, moderate glute max activation, and lower glute medius activation. However, remember the exercises we talked about before for the glute max: the lateral step up, the crossover step up, the single leg rotational squat, and then for the glute medius, we had the side lying hip abductions, we had the standing hip abductions with a band, or probably you can also use a cable. It just wasn't assessed in the study. And then just side bridge with hip abduction as well. Okay, so I want to read to you something that was said in the paper at the end, and that says, practitioners ought to consider trunk rotation in relation to the base of support, in addition to the direction of movement when applying a progressive strengthening program. Individuals who have difficulty performing standing exercises, such as the standing lateral leg abduction, etc., can benefit from using side-lying or seated exercises to strengthen the gluteal musculature. When strengthening a weaker muscle or muscle group, practitioners may wish to prescribe a gradual and progressive exercise program to ensure the targeted area is developed. This may be of importance if individuals seek and implement a compensatory movement pattern when faced with weakness or dysfunction. Individuals may benefit from being prescribed exercises that they can perform with good technique without substitution. Subsequently, once this can be achieved, exercise difficulty can be progressed with more difficult exercises. So what does that actually mean? Well, for example, in my case, where I had the very weak right glute med because of some sciatic nerve injury, I was always compensating with my left leg. So, for example, if you would have given me something bilateral or just like a squat or just like a hip thruster, so always my left side would be working more. Therefore, these unilateral things can be very helpful. This is part number one. Part number two would be that, okay, even with a step up or so, but probably would have performed that with poorer form on the right side than on the left side. So finding and choosing an exercise with which I can feel my glute and that specific area, so the med or max or whatever, would be very helpful. So just going with your client or even yourself through various exercises and like, where can I actually feel this and that muscle the best? Where can I actually connect mentally the best? In last week's or a couple of weeks ago, we talked about mind muscle connection. So what is an exercise, even if it might not be deemed optimal, but maybe you personally feel your glute medius the best when you're performing the seated hip abductions leaning forward. Maybe you feel it more when you're leaning backwards. Maybe you feel it more when you're doing it with a band standing up. Maybe you feel it more with a cable. It really, really, really depends. So what they're essentially saying is find the exercise that works best for you or for the client, and then progress slowly, even if another exercise might have been quote unquote deemed more optimal according to the findings. So overall, the significance that they're attributing to this paper, the findings underscore the importance of specific exercise interventions in the strength training and rehabilitation context for targeting gluteal muscles. Additionally, practitioners are encouraged to consider exercise complexity, position, and technique when designing strength and rehab programs. So again, if someone is completely new, might be easier to do something seated than standing, or might be easier to do something lying rather than standing, and so on, or more on the machines rather than with free weights. There were several limitations. For example, they didn't include all the exercises, like I said, none on the cable, for instance. Of course, machines are different, so there were certainly limitations. But the study aids in identifying which exercises are optimal for glute max and glute medius strengthening in abduction and rotational movements. The recommendation for practitioners is to emphasize carefully structured exercise programs which consider individual capabilities and the demands of each exercise. In conclusion, the research contributes significantly to the understanding of hip abduction and external rotation exercises, highlighting the nuances involved in gluteal muscle activation. The insights gleaned can assist in forming evidence-based practices for rehabilitation and athletic performance training, resonating with practitioners in sports science and physiotherapy. Lastly, I wanted to include this slide, which I have taken from Brett Contreras' page. I just find it super helpful. Before I talk about this, though, I personally like what I have taken away from this paper is I'm going to try to implement more lateral step-ups, more crossover step-ups, as well as not necessarily rotational single leg squats, but just like floating squats, single leg squats in general, and that also includes, Bulgarian split squats. I am not a huge fan of lying down, so I much prefer standing hip abduction exercises for the glute medius. I love doing them on the cable. I love doing them seated, but not so much lying. So I'm not a huge fan of like the clams or whatever, so I'm not going to include any of that. However, I have already included, cable abductions. I will say I haven't included a lot of the lateral step-ups, and that's why I'm specifically mentioning them. But maybe some of those exercises are standing out to you also. Again, lastly, this little graphic here, I hope you find it helpful, which is just kind of saying if you want to bring up a particular part of your glute, look at it and think about what could be specifically helpful. So here they did include the lateral band walk, like the monster walk, which this paper said was not super effective for glute medius, but apart from that, standing cable abductions, lying hip abductions, any kind of abductions more for the glute, the upper glute medius, and then of course they mostly refer to hip extension movements as opposed to abduction or rotational movements. But yes, hopefully you find this helpful. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you have any future topic recommendations or questions or so, please don't hesitate to hit me up, whether that be on Instagram, on here, or via email. And of course, you will find the link to the paper in the show notes. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you so much for listening.